All right, welcome back to ABA exam review and the continuation of our BCBA practice question series where we're going through another set of questions together and breaking them down. If you're new to the channel, welcome. If you're returning, welcome back. Please like and subscribe. Check out behavioranalyststudy.com for all of our study materials, including our combo pack. When you pass your exam, let us know so we can include you in the Sunday shout out. Work hard, study hard. Let's get going. A behavior analyst implements an intervention to increase a warehouse worker's productivity from a baseline average of 45 packages sorted per hour. The analyst sets successive criteria of 50, 55, 60, 65, and 70 packages per hour, with each criterion maintained for 1 week before advancing. The worker's performance closely follows each criterion level. However, colleagues suggest the improvements might be due to maturation or practice effects rather than the intervention. Which modifications might address this concern and strengthen internal validity? So we're starting with a long question. We're doing it intentionally. I don't want you to see long questions and panic or start to rush or skip them because they're long. Many times you might find that the long questions tend to be the easiest because remember, our strategy is to do all our work up front and then pick our answer. So we're trying to predict the answer choice. In this case, it's a very straightforward changing criterion question. We have an analyst who's using an intervention to go from 45 to 70. And he's using changing criterions, right? So he's slowly increasing the criterion. In this case, the worker's performance is following each level. So somewhere around here, which is exactly what you want to see with the changing criterion, right? However, the colleague smartly suggests, hey, improvements might be due to maturation or practice effects rather than the actual intervention. So what we're checking for is internal validity and some sort of experimental control. Now with a changing criterion design, how do we check for experimental control? And that's really the question you're asking yourself. So let's look at A. Extend the duration of each criterion phase to 2 weeks. Well, we already know the behavior is closely following each criterion phase. So extending them out likely isn't going to change that, especially if maturation or practice effects are confounding, because both maturation and practice effects will likely be more confounding the longer time goes. B, introduce a reversal to baseline between criterion changes. Now, with a changing criterion design, going back from 70 all the way to 45 isn't necessarily the best idea. Why? Because with a changing criterion design, there's a more empirical way to reverse the design, and that is to introduce a bidirectional change. So instead of jumping all the way back to baseline, we could go from, let's say, 65 or whatever this may be, back down to 60. If we actually have experimental control, what's going to happen? Well, the behavior is going to stay here. Once we drop it back down, it's going to stay right around the criterion. That's what we're looking for with changing criterion designs. So with a bidirectional change, we can start to see a stronger example of that experimental design. So, long question, but actually fairly straightforward. We did our work up front, and we could easily pick, predict, and spot the answer once we got to the answer choices. A behavior analyst is working with the client who engages in loud vocalizations approximately 40 times per hour. The analyst implements a procedure where the client receives access to preferred activities for every 5-minute period in which fewer than 3 vocalizations occur. The procedure is best described as what? So when we have a differential reinforcement question, we can always start by asking ourselves, are we teaching a replacement behavior? What 2 types of differential reinforcement teach replacements? Well, the DRA and the DRI. These teach replacements. DRLs, DROs, DRHs, DRDs, they're not necessarily teaching replacements. They're reducing or increasing or getting rid of behavior. So in this case, we have an analyst working with a client who is engaging loud vocalizations too much. They implement a procedure where the client receives access to activities when they engage in that behavior fewer than 3 times. Does it say they have to do a different behavior? No, we're not teaching a replacement. We're just trying to reduce the vocalizations. So we're trying to go fewer than 3. So since we're not teaching a replacement or an alternative or an incompatible alternative, we know we can cancel these out. So it leaves us with DRL and DRO. Well, DRO, what are we doing? We're reinforcing when the behavior doesn't occur. In this case, the behavior can still occur, just less than normal, which clearly is going to leave us with the DRL. So differential reinforcement, while being a pretty basic concept, if you do get twisted up or confused or whatever on the exam, you can pretty easily narrow them down with just a few questions. A driver consistently speeds on highways but drives at the speed limit in school zones and residential areas. Analysis reveals that the driver has received multiple speeding tickets in school zones but never on highways. Recently, the driver received their first speeding ticket on a highway and immediately reduced speeding on that particular highway segment but continued speeding on other highways. 2 weeks later, without any additional tickets, the driver resumed speeding on the original highway segment. This pattern best demonstrates what? All right, good question here. Question wants to know about the pattern. What are we looking at with this pattern? We have a driver speeding on highways, but driving at the speed limit in school zones and residential areas. Okay. It shows that the driver has received multiple speeding tickets in school zones, likely punishing it, right? Because they don't speed anymore, but never on highways. Okay, makes sense. Recently, the driver received their first speeding ticket on a highway. What happened? They reduced speeding. So clearly these tickets are functioning as punishment. Now, they're also speeding on other highways, and without any more tickets, they start speeding again on the original segment. Now, why would that happen if the behavior got punished? Well, what do we know about punishment? Well, we know punishment is not permanent. That's why we use reinforcement. Punishment isn't permanent. We've got to teach a replacement behavior and reinforce that replacement to replace the punished behavior. So what is this pattern demonstrating, knowing that? A, stimulus generalization of the punishing effect across highway context. Well, clearly punishment is not generalizing across context because this driver is speeding basically everywhere but in school zones. B, discriminated punishment with limited generalization and rapid recovery when punishment is continued. That sounds about right, right? Punishment's only effective in certain areas around certain stimuli. Generalization is low, and rapid recovery of the behavior occurs when punishment is discontinued. B looks pretty good. C, spontaneous recovery of an extinguished behavior. The behavior wasn't on extinction, right? It was punished. Remember, there's a difference between those two consequences. Habituation to the punishing stimulus. Habituation requires repeated presentation of the stimulus. In this case, the driver only got one speeding ticket, so they couldn't have habituated, or very unlikely that they habituated to the speeding ticket. It's much more likely that rapid recovery occurred when punishment was discontinued. A factory uses a light system to signal workers. A green light indicates that completed products should be placed on the left conveyor belt, reinforced on FR5, while a red light indicates products should be placed on the right conveyor belt, reinforced on FR or VR10. Workers reliably engage in the appropriate response based on which light is illuminated. This is an example of what? Now, immediately when we read this, you should think compound schedule, right? We have VR10, FR5. Let's just kind of write that out. FR5, VR10. When is the FR5 active, right? When a green light is lit, okay? So this is the green light. The red light indicates what? FVR10. So do we have an SD signaling which schedule is available? Well, clearly, green light says FR5, red light says VR10. So what kind of schedule would this be? Because they're not happening at the same time, right? We're looking at where the product should be placed, and they're kind of going back and forth in a semi-random manner. Is it a mixed schedule? Well, let's think about it. A mixed schedule and a multiple schedule are the same except for one thing. What? What's the one thing that differs? The multiple schedule has the SD, and here we have our SDs. Now, the concurrent schedule is what? It's choice. We're choosing schedules, different behaviors. They're not choosing schedules. The light is signaling to them what schedule they need to be engaged in. And then a chain schedule is when we have the schedules going back to back to back. These are rotating or altering in a semi-random manner. So knowing all of this, this is a multiple schedule or a compound schedule, multiple schedule. A university student and their academic advisor develop a written agreement stating that if the student attends all classes and completes all assignments for 1 month, they will receive a letter of recommendation for graduate school. This intervention is best described as what? All right, finish with a relatively easy one. We have a student and their academic advisor engaging in a written agreement. So when you see that, a written agreement, start thinking behavior contract. This agreement states the student must attend all classes and complete all assignments, and then they will receive a letter of recommendation. Now, if this is a written agreement, then the closest thing we have to that is a behavioral contract. So would you describe this as a token economy? Well, unlikely. There doesn't seem to be an exchange for the backup reinforcer. They have to engage in this contingent behavior. We already predicted behavioral contract. It looks like a behavioral contract. A group contingency. It doesn't appear anybody else is involved, just the advisor and the student. And contingency-shaped behavior. This is actually the rule-shaped or rule-governed behavior, I should say. Why? Well, the written agreement and not the contingency, but the stipulations are the rules. The recommendation, receiving that recommendation, will then be the reinforcement for the student, and that'll be contingent, right? But here, the student is following the rules. Attend classes, complete assignments, you get a recommendation. Therefore, the intervention is best described as a behavioral contract. Thanks for watching. Check out behavioranalyststudy.com for all of our study materials. When you pass your exam, let us know so we can include you in the Sunday shout-out. Work hard, study hard. See you soon.